Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Leanna Levine-Reisner, and I'm the Network Director of Plant-Powered Metro New York. It's a great joy to be with you today. And I wanted to just let you know, if you hadn't heard already, at Plant-Powered Metro, we are really dedicated to transforming lives and communities all across the Metro New York region through evidence-based nutrition education. Our mission is to empower you to achieve the health that you deserve and overcome chronic disease using whole food, plant-based nutrition. With International Women's Day right around the corner, we are presenting this series, Women's Wellness and Food, every Tuesday in March to celebrate women's health and our potential for healing through food. This is a topic really near and dear to me, as I lived with endometriosis for 15 years before discovering that whole food, plant-based nutrition had the power to alleviate and nearly eliminate my symptoms. A light bulb went off for me at that moment about the interplay of food and hormones, and I was just hooked and I had to learn more. And it goes so far beyond food and hormones, as we'll learn tonight. So if you're scratching your head wondering why women's bodies seem to be so prone to disease, and most especially the parts of us that enable new life to come into being, the real answer is that it doesn't have to be this way. What I've come to learn and what we'll explore throughout the month is that nutrition and lifestyle are really powerful forces to bring us back into balance, reducing our risk of both common ailments and very intense conditions that we often rely on drugs and surgery to address. So to bring this series to life, we're going to feature 4 incredible OBGYNs, each addressing different angles and stages of women's health. Our goal is to offer you new insights about women's reproductive health and the most practical tips that can enhance your health and well-being. I want to offer a special thanks to our collaborating partner for this series, Dr. Nasolo Teddy and the HeartSmarts community, which inspired this project. You're going to meet Dr. Teddy in our 3rd and 4th sessions later this month. But tonight is where it all begins. I invite all of you to introduce yourselves in our comments, whichever platform you're joining us from. Really glad to see everybody here tonight. And I want to begin with the introduction of our wonderful speaker, Dr. Padma Garvey. Dr. Garvey graduated from medical school at the University of Pittsburgh, and she completed her residency in Obstetrics and Gynecology from Weill Cornell, New York Hospital, right in the city. And she is dual board certified in Obstetrics and Gynecology and Lifestyle Medicine. She is currently a clinical assistant professor at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York, where she teaches future healthcare providers about lifestyle medicine. And what a wonderful thing that is. Over the years, she has educated herself and her patients on lifestyle medicine by producing cooking classes and cooking videos on YouTube, blogging for parent magazines, podcasting on Spotify, and she's also taught in the wonderful plant-based certificate program that's presented by the T. Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Garvey. Great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, Leanna. I just want to thank you, Leanna, and I want to thank Plant-Powered Metro New York. I'm really honored that you guys asked me to speak, and I'm excited. So I'll start with the lecture, and I'll bring up my slides. So I was asked to give an introduction to the topic of diet and how it relates to chronic medical conditions, especially those that affect women. And so I will touch on that, especially looking at how diet can impact our genes and our genetic expression. And then I'll also touch on how diet can affect our gut microbiome and the connection between our gut microbiome and problems such as vaginal infections and urinary tract infections. So it seems pretty obvious to us now that the kind of diet we eat has a huge impact on chronic medical problems that we may suffer from. But that wasn't always the case. Prior to World War II, scientists and physicians were not sure how or even if diet really impacted on one's chances of developing chronic medical problems like heart disease and diabetes. it was really during World War II when US Army scientists and physicians noticed that people living in certain regions of the world, like southern Italy, for instance, that people who lived in certain regions of the world had remarkably lower rates of heart disease than did Americans at that time, Americans back home at that time. And their observations led them to question, could diet have anything to do with the health that these people in certain parts of the world enjoyed? And one of the things that happened around the end of World War II is several large studies were conducted, one in particular, which is famous, fairly famous, called the 7-Country Study. It was done by a Dr. Ansel Keys, who was affiliated with the US Army. And what the 7-Country Study did was they looked actually at 20 countries, and they zeroed in on 7 in particular. And what they did was they measured the amount of fat that was in the diet of people in these various countries. And they noticed that countries that consumed lower fat in their diet had much lower rates of heart disease. There wasn't a perfect study. There were some countries that didn't fit the model, France, for instance. And so what really happened with the 7 countries study was that it prompted countries around the world to start looking into the connection between diet and chronic medical problems. And a lot of these countries started large longitudinal studies where they recruited lots of people and planned on watching these people over decades. And in the United States, around 1948, one such longitudinal study was launched called the Framingham Study. And in 1948, they recruited 5,000 people, both men and women, between the ages of 30 and 62, and just followed them to see if there were any patterns that emerged connecting certain lifestyle behaviors and certain dietary behaviors with chronic medical problems. And the Framingham study is still ongoing. They are now studying 3rd and 4th generation people that in the study. And most of the recommendations of the American Heart Association, most of their recommendations regarding smoking, what's the ideal blood pressure, what's the ideal diet, all of these recommendations that the American Heart Association makes, many of them came from findings of the Framingham Heart Study. Other studies that were very useful in connecting diet with chronic medical problems included what are called migration studies. And going back to 1850, around 1850, there was a large influx of immigrants to Hawaii from China, Korea, the Philippines, and Japan. And they came over to work on the plantations in Hawaii. And the diets of these people from these countries, include as well as the diets of native Hawaiians at that time, their diets tended to be very low in fat, unprocessed, no dairy, and very, very plant-based. And these original immigrants with these traditional low-fat diets, plant-based diets, had very low rates of heart disease and diabetes and obesity. But as they had children and as their children had children, with each subsequent generation, the diets that were consumed changed and they became more westernized, they became more processed, and they became more and more meat-centric. And as that happened, the rates of heart disease and diabetes and certain cancers increased. Another interesting observation that really suggests a strong connection between diet and health and menstrual cycles and women's health is that as the fat increases in the diet, and as this leads to increased body weight, what we see is that as the fat increases in the diet and as the body weight increases, the age of the first period goes down. And when that happens, it ends up that the woman has some more menstrual cycles in her lifetime than did someone whose first menses started later. And what we see is that from 1950 to now, the average age of the first period went down from 12.5 years to 11.9 years. And that's only a 6-month difference, and it might seem like that isn't significant. But when you're talking about large groups of people, a change like that actually does impact on health conditions such as breast cancer. And we see that the more menstrual cycles a woman has, the higher her risk for breast cancer and ovarian cancer. And what's even more alarming than this 6-month change is that actually the number of girls who get their first period at a very young age, 9 or 10, doubled from 1950 to present day. So our diets, there is a lot of evidence that our diets do affect our health. And there's many mechanisms by which this happens. But what I'm going to focus a little bit on is how diet affects our genes. It was assumed in the past that our genes are fixed at birth and that there's really nothing we can do about a genetic predisposition that we may have to certain medical problems. But research within the past 20 years has actually challenged this assumption. And based on research findings over the past 20 years, we're seeing actually that our genes can be altered. Our genetic expression can be altered through our diet and lifestyle. Some of this is based on a very famous study that came out of Duke University in 2012. When this study came out, it rocked the science world. What researchers did was there's a particular kind of mouse called the agouti mouse. And the agouti mouse has a gene called the agouti gene. And this agouti gene gives the mouse a yellow fur coat. And these mice have a tendency to be overweight, and they have higher rates of diabetes and heart disease, all kind of caused by this agouti gene. So researchers took 2 groups of pregnant agouti mice, and one group got fed a very poor diet, a nutritionally poor diet. And the other group got fed a very nutritionally rich diet with lots of vitamins. And when the 2 groups had their pups, what the researchers found was that the pregnant mice that were given the poor diet, they had pups that had the yellow coat, they were overweight, and they had increased risk for heart disease and diabetes. Whereas the group of mice that got fed the highly nutritious diet, their pups had a brown coat, they were thin, and they had lower rates of heart disease and diabetes. And what they found when they analyzed the genetics of these 2 groups, both groups of pups had the agouti gene. It's just that the group whose moms got fed the better diet, their agouti gene was turned off. Whereas the group that got fed the poor diet, their pups, their agouti gene was turned on. And this study was one of the first to show that diet can impact, can change, can alter the genetic expression in our bodies. And the way this happens is through a process called methylation. Methyl groups are chemical groups that are found in certain kinds of foods. And I think the easiest way to get to understand where methyl groups come from, what I tell my patients is methyl groups come from the naturally occurring vibrant colors in fruits and vegetables. The chemical that gives a carrot its orange color, the chemical that gives red cabbage its purplish color, these chemicals that impart these vibrant colors naturally in fruits and vegetables, they carry these methyl groups. And these methyl groups can coat our DNA and turn genes on and off. Another example of that suggests the power of diet and lifestyle and its impact on our genes relates to BRCA genes and breast and ovarian cancer. So the BRCA genes, there's two types, and these genes increase one's chances of developing breast or ovarian cancer. And one group of people who have a high degree of carrying the BRCA gene are Ashkenazis. And there's two countries in the world that have the largest population of Ashkenazis. That's the United States and Israel. And so you would think that the rates of breast cancer in these groups of Ashkenazis in the US and Israel would be similar. But what we find actually is that the rate of breast cancer in Israel is lower than that in the United States. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand. Israel still has a fairly high rate of breast cancer because of Ashkenazi and the BRCA gene, but their rate of breast cancer is lower than the United States. And the survival rate of women in Israel with breast cancer is better than that in the United States. And then when you look even further, when you look in the country of Israel itself, the rates of breast cancer are different. Rates of breast cancer are much higher in urban areas compared to rural areas in Israel. And all of this suggests that diet may play a role in affecting if we carry the BRCA gene, in affecting its expression. The classic Israeli diet tends to be Mediterranean, very plant-based and low in fat compared to the traditional American diet. And then if we went even one step further, hopefully I've given you some evidence that shows that the diet a mom eats can affect the expression of her own genes, and that the diet a mom eats can affect the expression of genes in her developing fetus. But the fetus also has cells inside its body that are going to become the future sperm or future eggs of that fetus. And so the mom's diet not only affects herself, it affects the fetus's genes, but it can also affect her grandchildren's genes. So it just shows you how powerful diet is and the influence diet can have on turning on and off the genes in our body, in our children's bodies, and our grandchildren's bodies. And the key here is that this kind of a diet that's rich in methyl groups, it's plant-based, it's fruits, vegetables, whole grains, unprocessed, that this is the kind of diet which is rich in these methyl groups. All right, so that was the introduction. I'm now going to spend the rest of my time talking about the gut microbiome and its connection to vaginal infections and urinary tract infections. So a healthy gut, our guts have both good and bad bacteria. They're found in everybody's gut. The good gut bacteria thrive on a diet of undigestible fiber, the fiber that our intestines can't digest. These good bacteria, these good gut bacteria, they love it, and they're able to break it down and use it for energy. The bad bacteria, the bad gut bacteria, they derive their energy from sources of food connected to animal products, animal flesh, not undigestible fiber. And the good gut bacteria, when it acts on this undigestible fiber to try and break it down, it does so through a process called fermentation. And by fermenting this undigestible fiber, the good bacteria break it down and they're able to use it for energy. But we actually benefit from them eating this undigestible fiber. One of the byproducts of this process is chemicals called short chain fatty acids. And short chain fatty acids, they help keep the lining of the gut intact. The gut, if it's not healthy, our gut lining can become leaky. It can develop holes that allow toxins and allergens to creep into our bloodstream. But with adequate short chain fatty acids, the lining is kept intact so that we don't develop food allergies or insensitivities. And these short chain fatty acids come from our good gut bacteria fermenting this undigestible fiber. Diets that are high in animal products and low in fiber, they actually promote the growth of bad bacteria. And as the level of bad bacteria rises, it's like the bad bacteria and the good bacteria are fighting a turf war. And if the bad bacteria, the levels rise, the good bacteria levels fall. So pictured here is a diet that would be ideal to promote good gut bacteria. And interestingly, if you notice all the bright colors that are on this picture, these are the colors that would also have methyl groups to help turn on and off the genes in our body. So this kind of a diet has so many functions. So people have been eating fermented foods for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, mostly because fermenting food was a way to preserve the food when you didn't have electricity or refrigeration. That was really the main reason why it was done. But eating fermented foods also does introduce good bacteria and kind of can kickstart your system. But I do want to point out that you don't have to eat fermented foods. As long as you eat a high fiber diet, your good gut bacteria will do the fermenting for you in your gut. So the bad bacteria, as I said, they thrive on a diet that's low in fiber, high in animal products and dairy. And as their numbers increase, the level of good bacteria declines. Now, these bad bacteria, when they break down their food, they release a very toxic substance called trimethylamine N oxide. And this substance, when it enters our bloodstream, it's associated with obesity, insulin resistance, inflammation, atherosclerosis, depression, early death. There are many studies like this, but one study in particular, they wanted to see how fast can someone's gut bacteria profile change. And what they did was they took volunteers, and before the study began, they analyzed the stool sample of the subjects to kind of get a fingerprint of the kind of bacteria that they had. And then they had all the study subjects eat a very healthy, low-fat, plant-based diet for several days. And each day they took stool samples and analyzed the bacteria profile. And then after several days, they had everybody switch to an animal-based diet. And again, every day on the animal-based diet, they analyzed everybody's stool and fingerprinted the kind of bacteria they had. And what they found was that when you switched from a plant-based diet to an animal-based diet, your microbiome fingerprint went from a good profile to a bad profile, and then back again if you switched back to the plant-based diet. And this change in some subjects occurred as quickly as 24 hours. So you may be wondering if you have a good gut microbiome and if there's an easy test to determine this. And there's a relatively easy, cheap test to determine whether or not your gut microbiome is healthy. If you have 2 to 3 large bowel movements a day that require little expulsive effort on your part, then chances are your gut microbiome is pretty good. If you're having issues with constipation, then changing your diet to a unprocessed, low-fat, plant-based diet will help. And eating fermented foods might kickstart your gut for you. Eating fermented foods does introduce good gut bacteria and may help the process along. Although, again, I do want to emphasize you don't have to eat fermented foods if you don't like them. If you don't like sauerkraut or kimchi or things like that, you don't have to eat them. So long as you eat a very high fiber diet, the good bacteria in your gut will do all the fermenting for you. So how does this gut microbiome, how is it connected to vaginal infections and urinary tract infections? Well, the bacteria in the vagina come from the gut. And so all the bacteria that's in your gut, both good and bad, is found in the vagina. There are one or two important differences, however. The cells of the vagina are very special. They are structured in such a way that they encourage the one particular bacteria to grow in large numbers and to attach to the vaginal lining cells. And that bacteria is lactobacillus. So the cells of the vagina, they really encourage the growth of lactobacillus. And so the amount of lactobacillus in the vagina is much higher than the amount of lactobacillus found in the gut. But all the other good and bad bacteria are found in the vagina as well. So this lactobacillus is very important. This bacteria, lactobacillus, produces 2 chemicals, lactic acid and hydrogen peroxide. And these 2 chemicals, the lactic acid and the hydrogen peroxide, they keep the levels of bad bacteria low. They're kind of like a disinfectant, and they kill or keep the level of bad bacteria in the vagina very low. If your gut microbiome isn't a healthy one, then the amount of lactobacillus in your vagina and the bacteria in your vagina is not going to be healthy. And you'll have lower levels of lactobacillus than you should. The other things that can disrupt the lactobacillus levels in the vagina are things like antibiotics, douching, excessive use of cleansers and soaps. All of these things can disrupt the level of lactobacillus in the vagina. Pictured on the right, I found an old magazine ad from 1920 where they are advertising a new douche that was available called Lysol. A lot of people don't know this, but Lysol was originally not a household cleaner, but marketed as a vaginal douche. So that, hopefully I've shown you that lactic acid and hydrogen peroxide that are produced by the lactobacillus, they're so beneficial for us. They keep the level of bad bacteria low in the vagina. Well, the meat industry knows this also. And what the meat industry does is they wash the carcasses of animals with solutions of lactic acid and hydrogen peroxide as a way to kill off bacteria on the meat carcasses. The thing is, however, any bacteria that survive on the meat carcass after it's been treated with these solutions of lactic acid and hydrogen peroxide, any bacteria that survives that is one that's resistant to lactic acid and hydrogen peroxide. And so when you eat this meat that has bacteria that's resistant to lactic acid and hydrogen peroxide, that bacteria colonizes your gut, and then it colonizes your vagina. And when it's in your vagina, the lactobacillus in your vagina is incapable of killing that bacteria since it's resistant to lactic acid and hydrogen peroxide. So the levels of these bad bacteria rise. The paleo diet, the Atkins diet, the keto diet, these diets that are high in animal products and low in fiber can all cause vaginal infections like bacterial vaginosis. And they do this because they introduce bacteria that are resistant to lactic acid and hydrogen peroxide. Now, explained about the vaginal infections, but then what about urinary tract infections? Well, the urethra is the small orifice right under the clitoris, and it's the small hole where the urine comes out. And in a woman, the urethra is maybe 2 centimeters long. It's very short. And the opening of the urethra sits right in front of the vagina. And in fact, the lactobacillus of the vagina also coats the lining of the urethra. And if there's healthy bacteria in the vagina, if there's a healthy amount of lactobacillus in the vagina, then the urethra will be coated with this lactobacillus. If there's not enough lactobacillus in the vagina, or if there's bacteria in the vagina that are resistant to lactic acid and hydrogen peroxide, then the urethra will be vulnerable to infections by these bacteria, and these bacteria can enter the bladder and cause a urinary tract infection. Even if you don't necessarily have a UTI, just if the problem is you don't have enough lactobacillus in the vagina, and there's not enough lactobacillus covering or coating the urethra, even though that can cause burning and irritation and burning with urination, even if there's not necessarily an infection. So if you do suffer from frequent UTIs, then one of the things that you can do to help significantly is to change your diet and start eating a diet that's rich in high fiber, low fat, unprocessed, plant-based diet. This diet that's high in this fiber encourages the growth of good gut bacteria, and we need this good gut bacteria to colonize the vagina and to encourage the vagina to have adequate levels of good bacteria like lactobacillus. And this lactobacillus keeps all the other bad bacteria in check. It coats the urethra, prevents the urethra from getting infected. And so this is how this lays out the connection between our diets and vaginal infections and urinary tract infections. And then I want to end on this note of a study that came out in 2010 that I saw through the CDC, and it really it made I was just shocked when I read this study. What they found was that the E. coli that was causing urinary tract infections in people was coming directly from the E. coli in their chicken, the chicken that they were eating. And that, prior to these studies, the assumption had always been that when someone suffers from a urinary tract infection because of E. coli, well, that was their gut E. coli that was causing the problem. That E. coli was in their gut, and that was the E. coli that was causing their urinary tract infections. But what this study and many others like it showed was that no, actually, you can connect the dots, that the chicken that these people ate had a very particular strand or type of E. coli, and that the urinary tract infections that these people developed was not from the E. coli in their guts, but was from the E. coli that they just ate from the chicken that they consumed. So it really connected the dots for a lot of people. And I used to say this to my patients all the time, and not jokingly. I would say, if you were admitted to the hospital, or if you had a family member in the hospital and you wanted to try and decrease your risk for a hospital-acquired infection, the simplest thing to do would be to get the meat off the patient's dietary tray, to eat plant-based in the hospital, because a lot of the bacteria that lead to infections in the hospital is actually coming from the meat that's being served to them on their patient trays. So hopefully the talk that I presented today was useful. I hope that it's something that you can, it came with some practical information that you can apply to your daily life. And I'm happy to take questions at this point.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Garvey. This is full of really interesting information, and great that you started at the beginning, really laying the foundation of what we know about diet and health overall, and then of course zooming in on women's health, women's reproductive health. So I wanted to ask you, as questions are starting to come in from our audience members, I definitely encourage everybody to share what you will. Some of these topics are sensitive topics, so feel free to ask them without regard for judgment here. But I want to go back at the very beginning. You talked about the age of the first period, women's menses, and the increased risk of breast cancer. Can you say a bit more about what's actually happening in the body that is leading women to have longer periods of time when they're in their fertility phase? You mentioned the fat content of the diet.
Yeah.
What is it?
So it's complicated, too complicated for me to really give it like tremendous justice. What I'll say is this, that a lot of research has been done looking at what actually triggers puberty. Like, how do our bodies know it's time to go through puberty? What is it? What signal? Is it the sun rays? What causes our bodies to decide, okay, now is a time that we will enter puberty? So a lot of research has been done looking at it. And one of the things that seems to make the most sense, I mean, it's probably many factors, but one of the biggest factors is the amount of fat in our body, our body fat percentage. And if you have children of the right age, as I do, if you go back through their school pictures, almost invariably, they get, even if they were thin before, they get to a slightly chubby phase right before they go through puberty. And it's this accumulation of body fat at the right time seems to trigger the brain to start making hormones that leads to puberty starting. So as the fat in our diets, as there's more fat in our diets, there's more childhood obesity. We have more children who have a tendency to be on the heavier side, and this can trigger earlier puberty and start their periods earlier. And I will say, it's not always apparent. Like, you can be a very thin person, a very thin child, thin person, and still have fat accumulation, like in your liver. In fact, I would have patients all the time. Like, it shocked me. They were thin and yet had a fatty liver. And that's because of fat in your diet. So there's some connection between the fat in our diet that our body senses, and that triggers puberty to start.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Just watching it in my own kids too, as I'm raising healthy plant-based kids who are fairly lean, and seeing how, I got my period at the age of 11. My daughter's 14 and hasn't gotten hers yet. I hope that's good for her in the
Yeah.
long run, right?
Listen, if she's eating a healthy diet and she's a healthy kid, that's normal. There were reports I read where I think schools, like a decade ago, elementary schools were realizing that they had to put in feminine hygiene product dispensers in elementary school. And that was a shock because, they weren't required until you got into high school or junior high. And so it's just reflecting, again, like, it's difficult to say, oh, 6 months more of having your period increases you patient A's risk for breast cancer. We're talking about like big numbers. Like, when you look at large populations of people, that difference in 6 months does actually translate to higher risk of breast cancer in your lifetime.
That's fascinating. We had somebody ask in the comments. They said they started their cycle at 14 years. Menopause ended at 57. Early, though, they had painful, sometimes irregular periods and fibroids. Is this a situation where if somebody has that length and those particular symptoms might be at higher risk for cancer postmenopausal?
It's hard to say for one specific person, and I don't want, I don't want to paint it as that. These connections that we make between the number of menstrual cycles a woman has and her risk for ovarian or breast cancer, you can't apply it to one single person. It's a large trend when you look at large numbers of people. And I think it's easier to understand if I put it in these terms. Most people will agree that smoking increases your risk for lung cancer. But actually, 10 out of 11 smokers do not get lung cancer. So most smokers don't get lung cancer. But the people who get lung cancer, a lot of them tend to have smoked. So it's you kind of have to look at it the same way, that just, if one single person got their period earlier than another person, you can't say, oh, okay, this particular person's chances of getting breast cancer are X amount higher than this person. We're talking about big, large averaging of numbers.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really helpful. And it's so hard, I think, for us to, as human beings, to say, okay, but what's in it for me here? What can I do? So
I think that you never know. Like,
Yeah.
that's the thing, right? You never know what are you at risk for this. So to play it safe, I think you have to assume that you are, and what's the thing that you can control. There's so many things we can't control, but the one thing we can control is what we eat. And so if you focus on, low fat, plant-based, unprocessed you're going a long way toward improving your health and decreasing your risks for all sorts of things. It's not a guarantee. Again, we can only make comments like this when we average out large groups of populations of people. But I think that's the wisest approach to it is eat as if you are at risk for these things and approach life that way.
Yeah, absolutely true. Thank you. There's another question about fibroids. I wonder if you know if there are dietary bases for fibroids and whether we can end up shrinking them or improving the impact of fibroids using diet.
So, there's nothing that has been, um, in medicine and science, when we recommend something, we want it to be evidence-based. And so what that means is it's supported by research, either like a randomized controlled trial or longitudinal studies or some kind of scientific study that's shown that something may have benefit. And diet diet as far as impacting fibroids and the size of fibroids, I there's nothing that's concrete about it. What I will say is this: just like the number of menstrual cycles a woman has, the higher the number of menstrual cycles, the higher her risk for breast and ovarian cancer. Same too with fibroids. The higher her risk for fibroids, the higher her risk for endometriosis. A lot of these reproductively, the cyclical reproductive issues, the risk for breast cancer, ovarian cancer, fibroids, endometriosis seems to go up the more periods you have.
Got it. Yeah. And so in this circumstance, we probably don't have the evidence to say, oh, interventionally, we can show an impact on an existing disease process in fibroids.
Yeah, there's really it's not there isn't evidence like that where I could say yes, we have fairly conclusive proof that changing your diet will shrink your fibroids. I can't say that. I
Mhm.
think changing your diet will definitely make you feel better. I think changing your diet improves so many other things about your body that will help. But as far as like if someone had fibroids and they wanted to know, is there a particular way to eat that would prevent them from growing or shrink them, I would say the safest way to eat would be like a low fat plant-based diet. That way of eating tends to decrease your risk for insulin resistance and insulin growth factors and all of these other things that might be tied in to fibroid growth as well.
Mhm.
But I can't say, oh, we have like really solid evidence about this.
Yeah, but thanks for bringing up the growth hormone element of this, because I think that's where, in my own learning, understanding that what we eat actually can elevate different kinds of growth hormones. Some of them are, related to blood sugar, and some of them are related
Yep.
to cancers, and some of
Yep.
them to fibroids. So I think that's a really important idea, just to distill it for, for the layperson watching. There are a few other questions that came in, and one person just asked about uterine cancer. You mentioned breast and ovarian cancer, and I know that a lot of these female cancers are hormonally tied. Is uterine cancer one of those as well? Is it a genetic thing for women to have uterine cancer, or is it also lifestyle in here?
So there are to the endometrial cancer. So there's various types of uterine cancer, but the one that's the more common one is called endometrial cancer. That's cancer of the lining of the uterus. And there are some rare genetic conditions called Lynch syndrome, which can increase your risk for endometrial cancer. But by and large, most of the endometrial cancers uh, that we deal with endometrial cancer is actually the most common GYN cancer. It is not genetic, but it is actually one of the few cancers that we know if you lose weight, if you change your diet, you will reduce your risk for endometrial cancer. 90% of endometrial cancers are because of excess estrogen produced by fat cells. And so women who want to avoid endometrial cancer should get their BMI down, low fat plant-based diet. That kind of a diet does help with that.
Yeah, thank you. And you're reminding me now of this powerful idea that I think I want everybody to take home, which is that the extra fat that we have in our bodies is in itself, hormonal,
Yes.
right? Can you say a little bit more about that? Because I think this is something that the population doesn't know.
Yeah, no, fat cells, a lot of people think we should consider fat another endocrine organ. Like, we have our thyroid, that's an endocrine organ. Our ovaries are an endocrine organ. Cells in our pancreas are an endocrine organ. And a lot of people think, you know what, we should say fat is an endocrine organ because it produces so many different hormones, hormones that suppress your appetite, increase your appetite, growth factors, and estrogen. The fat cells produce a particular type of estrogen. And so, yeah, fat is definitely hormonally, it produces a lot of hormones. And even the location of the fat is different. So fat that's more around your chest area, your trunk area, produces hormones that are different from fat that accumulates like cellulite around your thighs and things like that. Even location of fat makes a difference.
Wow, that says so much too, because everybody's like, oh, well, I gain weight in different places on my body, and
Yeah.
therefore maybe it
And they probably do because of different, diets. Or yeah, I could believe that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, I want to take it in a different direction. We've had 2 questions about vaginal dryness. What is diet implicated in this in any way?
Well, vaginal dryness is very common. I would say most women, when they hit 45 and older, will start to experience vaginal dryness. And a lot of it is because, 45, you start the beginning of that perimenopausal process, and our estrogen levels start to go down. And the lubrication of the vagina is stimulated by adequate estrogen levels. And so as you start this perimenopausal process and your estrogen levels go down, vaginal dryness is a very common problem. I don't think I don't think that there's a particular diet which would completely solve the problem, because think about it this way, that the problem is happening because your ovaries are kind of winding down, and that's a natural thing that has to happen. It starts happening around 45. It's got to happen. It's natural. It's normal. And so we're not going to be able to eat foods that are going to make our ovaries produce estrogen again. I think that a lot of women, if they are having issues with a lot of vaginal dryness, there are some like over-the-counter lubricants or even coconut oil that you can apply that can help. But most of that vaginal dryness, most common reason, is going through perimenopause and the ovaries kind of slowly winding down and decreasing the amount of estrogen that they're making.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. I also wanted to ask, and I'll make a note for our listeners. There will be some times during the rest of the series this month when we can go deeper on these topics, as we're going to be talking about menopause and perimenopause in our 3rd session. We're going to be talking more about urogynecological issues in our 4th session. So come back. We can go deeper and explore these topics more. I'm going to jump around a little bit right now. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned about the health of our bowel movements. And I'm very curious about, the role of constipation in women's health. I've been thinking a lot, just, on a personal level, about how the proximity of our bowel to our organs is quite noteworthy. And could it be the case that when we are stopped up, when we're not moving our bowels as properly as possible, that we're actually contributing to poor health in that way too? What do you know about constipation and its role in women's reproductive health, if there is a connection at all?
Oh, no, there definitely is. If someone who's constipated, you really have to be concerned that they don't have a good gut gut microbiome.
Mhm.
And that, like, really the one test, like I said, is if you're having like 2 to 3 large bowel movements requiring very little expulsive effort, that's a pretty good sign that your gut microbiome is okay. If that's not the case, you it's a sign that your gut microbiome is not okay. And the long-term implications might be, is there too much of these bad chemicals that the bad gut bugs produce, that the TMAOs that I talked about, that are linked with obesity and heart disease and all of these things. So yeah, I think if you are suffering from constipation, I think that you need to figure out, look, how can I introduce more plant fiber? Where can I get rid of animal products? And maybe that's, if you're doing all of those things and you're still suffering from constipation, then maybe some fermented foods with every meal, like a tablespoon of sauerkraut with every meal, might help just get things going.
That's great. Yeah. I've also found that having a bit more raw food in the diet, having more green vegetables
Mhm.
can help move things. Because even with a nice plant-based diet, with the cooked food can sort of get
Sit
through
there.
the
Yeah.
system differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Um, all right, another question has come in, which is, what are your thoughts about hormone replacement therapy? This is definitely something that has I would say, even diversity within the plant-based health world about
Mhm.
what people think about it. What are the pros and cons from your perspective?
So, a large part of how I feel about it is a reflection of, I'm 60 years old, so I was trained. I did my residency. I started in 1992, ended in 1996, and right before I started residency, the the medical community, based on evidence, based on the studies, based on what was available, they really thought that hormone replacement therapy was a good thing. They really were hopeful, or hoping that it would decrease a woman's risk for heart disease. Uh, it did prevent osteoporosis. It did help with hot flashes. Uh, and so the feeling was that hormone replacement therapy has a lot of benefits, that the benefits outweighed the risks. The risks were increased risk of stroke, heart attack, blood clots, endometrial cancer, um, a slight increased risk of breast cancer. But they thought, you weigh the risks and the benefits, that the benefits outweigh the risks. But there were two big studies that came out. The nurses study and uh, the World Health Organization study came out, and those two studies really showed, or seemed to suggest, that actually the benefit with heart disease isn't as great as we thought, and that the risk from blood clot and stroke and heart attack is definitely there. There's increased rates of breast cancer. Um, and so that was how the era in which I was trained, and so my training was based on the understanding that hormone replacement therapy actually didn't have as much benefit as we thought, and so that definitely clouds my feeling about it. I really didn't like starting women on hormone replacement therapy. I never did. If the patient wanted it, and if she listened to my spiel, and let me get my thoughts out and still wanted to take it, I would reluctantly start her on it. But I definitely didn't like starting women on it. And I didn't actually, most of the time I was able to discourage its use. However, recently, there's been more and more, there's been a slow shift in the pendulum, and some studies are showing, the benefits are there. Women suffer from hot flashes. Why do women need to suffer from hot flashes? It's one thing to have a hot flash if you're in your log cabin in 1880 and no one's seeing you, but it's another thing to have to deal with hot flashes if you're running a board meeting. And so the thinking now is like, why are we denying women a treatment that helps them deal with what can be a very uncomfortable, challenging time in their life? And the other thing that's come up is, when you really look at, I said that the risks of hormone replacement therapy are increased risk of breast cancer, increased risk of stroke and MI, and all of these things. Well, yes, there is an increased risk, but I don't have the exact number, so I'm kind of just make up numbers to make it simple, but to convey the thought. But the increased risk is like, 2 in 10,000 versus 0.5 in 10,000. Like it's gone up quite a, it's quadrupled, but it's still a small number. And that most women who take hormone replacement therapy are not going to have a heart attack, and they're not going to have a stroke, and they're not going to have a blood clot, and it's not really going to increase their risk of breast cancer. So it's like how you look at the numbers. And then my own, like, this is not science or medicine related at all. It's just my personal opinion. I'm always fearful that there's a real tendency to over medicinize certain things, especially when it comes to women's health, right? I feel like there's a real, it seems like there's always a pill that people want to prescribe, that they want to sell you. And we go from like, needing birth control when we're reproductively active, to then here's another pill to get you through the next 40 years of your life. And it's like, I kind of feel like we over medicinize things that are natural. But I also like do understand, like, having hot flashes and going through menopause and working and dealing with the outside world, and it's not, it's not 1950 anymore. It's different. And so I get it. I don't know. Like I said, I retired, so I don't have to make a decision on this anymore. I feel like, that was when I left when I stopped practicing, I was still saying no to it. So
Yeah, no, thank you. And you make it very real also. Obviously, we we're here because we know that there's power in lifestyle and in food, and yet we have Western medicine. And so we have to reckon with this. And the answer for one woman might be different from the answer for another. And I think it's really important that we take it case by case, as you're saying, and look at the evidence. And we'll see what Dr. Fontaine has to say about this in 2 weeks as well.
yeah.
No,
I'm sure you'll get like a million opinions about it.
sure. Yeah, and why not get into it? Because I think that's the beauty of our ability to learn and wrestle with these topics, is hearing all these different opinions. So thank you, really insightful. And you're reminding me, of course, to mention to our audience that all of these changes that we can make through food can impact medicine, not just the choices that we might make in the future, but ones that we might be on now. So for those who are watching and are considering change, just be sure to talk to your doctor about how food might impact what you are taking. So I think we're coming to the end here, Dr. Garvey, but this was really insightful. Do you want to close with some?
Can I just show a link to the podcast that I am doing with, how do I get this up there?
Yeah, actually, we just put the podcast link into the comments for our YouTube and Facebook watchers.
Oh, okay. So as I said, I'm clinical assistant professor at Marist University, and the PA students and I have a podcast that's available on Spotify called Marist Health Forum. And I would love it if you could spread the word and people check it out. I think the students have done a great job, and it is part of the curriculum. Future healthcare providers are being taught lifestyle medicine at Marist, so check it out.
Awesome. Thank you. It's really great to learn with you tonight and to share in your wisdom. I know we have a very active and interested audience this evening, so thank you so much for being with us. And I want to just give a send off to our crowd. Definitely go and find Dr. Garvey online, not only with her podcasts, but there's also some great classes that she's offered on YouTube in the past. You can also find many more offerings from Plant Powered Metro New York on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. So as we close out this evening, I want to give a special thanks to our Plant Powered Metro New York core team members, Karina Pierce and Jim Spellos, for supporting our live stream behind the scenes. And again, to Dr. Nasolo Teddy and the HeartSmarts community, which we have seen in full force tonight. Thank you so much. Looking ahead, we invite you to join our next Women's Wellness and Food online live stream event, which will be a week from tonight, Tuesday, March 11th. I'm going to be back with Brooklyn-based physician Dr. Melinda Mann to help us better understand the connection between nutrition and fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth. We have a lot of ground to cover next week, so I hope you'll join us and also share this information with the women and anyone of any gender in your life who might be interested in these topics. You can learn more about the whole series and register for a reminder in the link that I'm going to post in the chat, which is on our website. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, which we definitely encourage you to do to get notices when we go live. And of course, going live and being here with you virtually is only one piece of what we do. There are many things that we offer in person in the New York metro area. So come and find us and the upcoming events that we have planned. And please, as always, consider making a donation to support our work. We are a nonprofit organization, and every bit helps us reach more communities with important nutrition information across the lifespan. So again, we have a text to give on the screen, and I'm offering up a link for donating. So from all of us here in the studio, we hope to see you in the next program, whether live or virtual. Best wishes for good health, and thinking of all those women out there who are looking for answers and hoping that you're starting to find them here. Have a great evening.